Then we opened up a pawn shop. So it's all I've ever done. I enjoy doing it.
I'm sentencing you to the mandatory sentence of life in prison without parole.
Rick Harrison collapsed right in the courtroom when the evidence against him was presented. The Las Vegas federal courtroom was suddenly thrown into chaos as his body, once a television icon from the show Pawn Stars, suddenly fell to the cold stone floor. His face went blank, and his heart almost stopped beating. The life sentence without parole had just been read, and immediately after, Rick, with no defense left, completely collapsed, both physically and in terms of the image he had built over more than a decade. Just moments before, the prosecutors had unveiled a series of evidence that left the courtroom holding its breath. Encrypted emails, a recording of Rick instructing to delete documents, hide the buyer, and transaction records worth millions of dollars from offshore accounts linked to stolen artifacts from the Middle East, Europe, and Asia. So, what led to this tragedy? How could someone once seen as the guardian of history end up being judged by history itself? Is the truth simply what has been presented in the evidence, or is there something darker being concealed? Let's dive into this in today's video. 1. The facade of a legend. It's no coincidence that Rick Harrison is seen as the embodiment of the modern American dream, a symbol of willpower, intelligence, and the ability to rise above adversity. Born in 1965 in San Diego, Rick suffered from severe epilepsy as a child, which forced him to stay bedridden for weeks at a time. While his peers ran around the streets, Rick found joy and life in books. History, economics, strategy, and psychology, all of these formed the solid knowledge base that helped him become a master negotiator and appraiser. Although he didn't finish high school, Rick was never someone lacking in understanding. For him, the value of a person isn't in a diploma, but in the ability to comprehend and navigate the world around them. Starting as a young man who had to take on various jobs to survive, Rick, along with his father, Richard the Old Man Harrison, opened a small pawn shop in Las Vegas called Gold and Silver Pawn Shop. Initially, the shop only sold coins, but gradually it expanded to include historical items, antiques, weapons, paintings, and valuable jewelry. It was here that Rick honed his sharp negotiating skills and developed the ability to sense the true value, not just of the item, but of the person who owned it. However, what set Rick apart wasn't just his business acumen, but also his media vision. Realizing that every item had a story to tell, Rick persistently pitched the idea of a television show to major networks. Finally, in 2009, the History Channel agreed to air Pawn Stars. In no time, the show became a global phenomenon. Rick's image, with his sharp gaze, half smile, and famous catchphrase, "You never know what's going to walk through that door," became a household saying for millions of people. Rick wasn't just the pawn shop owner. He was the judge, the expert, the storyteller. Viewers were captivated by the way he made decisions, uncovered the truth about an item, and negotiated each cent with ruthless precision. Pawn Stars not only brought Rick money and fame, but it also transformed Gold and Silver Pawn Shop into a tourist destination, turned Rick into a best-selling author, a conference speaker, and a distinguished guest at political events. Rick Harrison was no longer just a businessman. He had become a brand, an icon, and the face of success. But it was also from this point that the first cracks began to form, because when all eyes are on you, the one thing you can't do is hide. 2. The first cracks and signs of decline. Long-lasting success often makes people overlook the early warning signs. For Rick Harrison and the Pawn Stars empire, the first signs of trouble didn't necessarily come from the media or the authorities, but rather from changes in his personality, behavior, and business mindset. In the earlier seasons, Rick came across as calm, witty, intelligent, and humble. However, by the 5th season, observant viewers started noticing a shift. His smile appeared less often, negotiations became tougher and more focused on dominance, and appraisals increasingly centered around ultra-rare items valued from tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars. A stark contrast to the earlier episodes that had a more relatable and down-to-earth feel. What started as a show about simple stories, everyday people, and emotionally meaningful items gradually turned into a showcase for expensive, luxurious, and at times, suspicious artifacts. Some antique experts who had previously collaborated with the show began whispering about how some items couldn't be traced back to a clear origin. One appraiser who used to be a regular in the early episodes eventually chose to cut ties, leaving behind a blunt message. "I don't work with things I can't verify the origin of." Around the same time, things inside the shop began to shift. Rick demanded full control over all major transactions, no longer allowing junior staff to be involved or to keep detailed records as they once had. Several longtime employees quietly left without offering any official explanation. New hires were required to sign strict non-disclosure agreements, NDAs, had limited access to storage areas, and were absolutely prohibited from sharing any internal information. A few people in the industry who came by the store, which used to openly welcome visitors, were suddenly denied entry into the storage sections. However, what truly drew the attention of investigators wasn't the internal changes. It was the money. Despite the show still attracting millions of viewers, financial analysts noticed a suspicious spike in the profits of the gold and silver pawnshop and other businesses linked to Rick. A report from the IRS revealed that the store's reported earnings were significantly off from what would be expected based on media revenue and customer traffic. On top of that, there was a noticeable increase in payments from offshore accounts, particularly those from Cyprus, Turkey, and parts of Eastern Europe. Rick didn't flinch. On TV, he kept smiling, shaking hands, and posing for pictures with fans. But behind the scenes, it was a different story. He tightened control, upgraded the security systems, and began conducting more transactions in cash, a method often associated with operations lacking transparency. A former employee later revealed, "Rick once said something that sent chills down my spine. The most valuable thing in this store isn't any item. It's the trust people have in me. And once that trust is broken, the fallout could be more devastating than anyone could imagine." 3. Inside the underground empire. If Pawn Stars is the glittering tip of the iceberg of success, then the hidden financial system beneath it is the massive, cold, and dangerous mass that dragged Rick Harrison into the shadows. The deeper investigators delved into the businesses he operated, the more they uncovered a tangled web of shell companies, set up across multiple states and countries, from Delaware to the British Virgin Islands. These companies were often registered under the names of family members, acquaintances, or anonymous intermediaries. The transactions were intricately designed to be untraceable. Money from the sale of rare artifacts would pass through 3 to 5 intermediary accounts. Some deals were done entirely in cash, and all accompanying documents were labeled with internal codes like EC1, MAP 17, or Luxor 9, making it nearly impossible to identify the specific item involved. Rick was the only person who could decode these labels. Several bank accounts were opened in countries with loose financial regulations, such as Cyprus, Kazakhstan, and Lebanon, serving as exit points for illicit funds. In some instances, extremely rare artifacts like medieval map fragments, ancient Egyptian statues, or Torah scrolls missing since World War II had appeared in Rick's store without any legal documentation to prove their origin. Many of these items weren't displayed publicly, but were involved in special transactions with secretive clients, often collectors from the Middle East, Russia, or Asia. These individuals paid in cash or via transfers from intermediary companies, never revealing their identities. Even the store's management staff were forbidden from asking questions. Notably, a basement behind the shop, originally used to store valuable items, had been converted by Rick into a restricted area, accessible only to a select few. When investigators searched this space, they found hundreds of artifacts that had never appeared on television or in any records. including 2 statues believed to have been stolen from Peru, a collection of Civil War-era currency, and an ancient Greek sculpture of unknown origin. But Rick wasn't just trading in antiques, he was dealing in trust. By leveraging the show's image, he made people believe that any item he appraised had undergone strict authentication. Collectors had no reason to doubt him, and million-dollar transactions became the norm. Some items briefly appeared on the show with the caption "replica," but were later sold as genuine pieces to international collectors at sky-high prices. This was a legal loophole Rick often exploited to avoid criminal liability. Internal emails, later retrieved from the company's servers, revealed that Rick had instructed his staff to clean provenance for artifacts with unclear origins by fabricating stories like inherited from a great-grandfather, a gift from a European friend, or purchased at an auction in a state that doesn't keep detailed records. At times, Rick even hired fake experts to appear on the show and verify the item's value and legality. Every step was carefully planned to reinforce a facade of legitimacy over an underground smuggling operation. Within this network, Rick also set up off-site storage, typically warehouses on the outskirts of Las Vegas or in other states, where sensitive items were kept before being processed. Several employees recounted being sent to pick up goods at unofficial meeting spots, sometimes in parking lots, bars, or even private airstrips, then transporting them back using personal vehicles to avoid the company's GPS tracking system. The empire Rick Harrison built was no longer just a family-run pawn shop. It had turned into a tightly organized, illicit financial network with clear hierarchies, intermediaries, and most notably, a media-friendly image that helped conceal its tracks. When questioned by a partner about the legality of an Egyptian bronze statue, Rick simply said, "If you still have doubts, just rewatch 10 seasons of Pawn Stars. Everyone believes me." And indeed, millions did, until it all came crashing down. 4. The whistleblower and the beginning of the federal investigation. In any empire built on secrecy and manipulation, the greatest threat isn't the journalist or the special agent. It's the person who once stood inside the walls of power and then chose to step into the light. For Rick Harrison, that person was Gary Wexler, a quiet but loyal former employee who had worked at the gold and silver pawn shop for nearly 5 years and was one of the very few trusted to handle high-value transactions. Gary wasn't a familiar face on TV and rarely appeared in broadcast episodes, yet he held the key to a door Rick never thought anyone would have the courage to open. At first, Gary's suspicions weren't accusatory in nature. He was simply a dedicated, competent employee who sensed that something wasn't quite right. Items were vanishing from the system without explanation. Transactions worth hundreds of thousands of dollars had no receipts, no inventory codes, and no one was taking responsibility for record keeping. He brought his concerns to his direct supervisor, even to Corey, Rick's son, but only got vague responses like, "That's been handled by upper management," or "That's above your pay grade." The turning point came when Gary discovered a bronze statue among a shipment from Europe that bore a strange symbol, a mark he recognized from an Interpol bulletin he'd seen a few months earlier. It turned out to be a stolen artifact from a museum in Syria, taken during the country's civil war. This was no longer just a feeling. This was solid evidence of a crime. Gary knew that confronting Rick directly could cost him his job, or worse, drag him into a network he had no intention of being part of. So he chose a third option. He reached out to an old college friend who now worked at the FBI, someone he had known during an internship program. He didn't come forward with a dramatic accusation, just a simple question. "I think you guys should take a look at this item." That single statement marked the quiet but relentless start of a federal investigation that would stretch on for nearly 3 years and ultimately lead to the complete downfall of a national icon. The FBI did not rush into the investigation. They acted carefully and with a well-thought-out plan. Gary was instructed to remain in his current position, continue his work, and start recording conversations inside the company. Ultra-small listening devices were placed in phones, watches, and even in his briefcase. He quietly gathered internal emails, handwritten invoices, photos of the warehouse area, and the work logs he had previously kept as a personal habit. These scattered pieces of data slowly formed a bigger picture. Untraceable antiques were being brought to the store, sold to VIP clients without any records, money was being transferred to accounts overseas, and the person overseeing the final stage was Rick. One of the most crucial pieces of evidence Gary collected was an audio recording of Rick instructing his employees to carry out a transaction with no paperwork, no identification, no taxes. In another email, Rick directed to erase the records of an antique painting by creating a story of inheritance from an Italian family, with no surviving relatives to verify. These seemingly isolated details, when put together, revealed a sophisticated and calculated network. The FBI expanded their investigation, tracing cross-border money transfers, tracking international shipments, and reviewing the financials of companies listed under Rick and his family members' names. They discovered multiple accounts in Switzerland, Cyprus, and Kazakhstan, with total transactions amounting to tens of millions of dollars over 7 years, none of which were reported to the IRS. Notably, a shipment marked EC3 was held up at a Greek port during a customs inspection. It contained several stolen antiques from a museum in Rome, taken in 2005. This shipment had been sent from a warehouse in the outskirts of Las Vegas, which Rick leased under the name of a company, with Corey listed as the director. Gary was not the only one. When the FBI conducted secret interviews, a former internal accountant, whose identity was concealed, agreed to cooperate. This person provided a detailed spreadsheet showing underground cash flows, untraceable expenses, and stated that Rick had personally instructed to falsify transaction records to avoid audits. A solid chain of evidence was built, and when the curtain was lifted, the entire world saw clearly. Behind the glow of Pawn Stars was a carefully organized web of illegal financial activities. 5. The FBI raid and the unveiling of a legend. On the morning of March 22, 2025, as a light fog still lingered over Las Vegas, the faint glow of neon lights from the night before continued to illuminate the most famous street in America. However, to the north of the city, a convoy of black SUVs without license plates quietly approached a building familiar to millions of viewers. Gold and Silver Pawn Shop. With a search warrant in hand, the FBI agents, fully equipped and organized in a tactical formation, were ready to break through the seemingly impenetrable facade of Rick Harrison. At 6:02 a.m., they began their operation. No sirens, no commotion. The security cameras were disabled using access codes provided by a cooperating employee. As the front door opened, the agents flooded in swiftly, like ghosts. The display room looked just like any other day, neat, antique, and bathed in the glow of television lights. But that was only the surface. Their real target was the office in the back, the sealed basement, and the safes containing encrypted documents. One safe was opened with a code from a former manager, revealing brown envelopes containing handwritten receipts from 2013 to 2021, most of which were marked cash only, or had cryptic codes like LX17 and Blue Crate. In the basement, the agents discovered hundreds of artifacts, including 2 statues from Peru labeled as replicas, a set of Civil War-era coins, and a Greek bust that had been reported stolen from a national museum. All of these lacked import records, appraisals, and legal documentation. Meanwhile, at Rick's private residence, located about 20 minutes from the shop, another team began conducting a search. Rick was present. There was no resistance, no change in expression, just silent acceptance. In his office, the FBI collected numerous notebooks detailing off-the-books transactions, several passports, and flight records to the Middle East, Eastern Europe, and Balkan nations, all matching the times of the suspicious deals. That very day, the media exploded. News outlets rushed to report with bold headlines. Rick Harrison under FBI investigation for illegal artifacts trading. Pawn Stars' empire crumbles. From TV to prison, the Las Vegas shock. Collectors began to speak out. Some admitted they had felt something wasn't right, but could never have imagined Rick was the one pulling the strings. History Channel immediately stopped airing old episodes and announced they were reviewing their partnership. At FBI headquarters, the evidence was swiftly processed. Over 300 artifacts were cataloged, tagged, and sent for examination. Hard drives, phones, and servers had their data copied in full. Preliminary results showed at least 17 items were under investigation by Interpol, including 3 pieces that belonged to national museums in Europe. Encrypted emails were decoded, revealing that Rick used specialized terminology to describe transactions. LX, SAO, Middle Eastern client, ECE, European client, Clean E, needs to erase records, Vatican EE, top secret. One email left the entire investigation team stunned. Rick had messaged a partner saying, "Don't let it leak, because the cameras will never capture the full truth." 6. The complete collapse. The federal court in downtown Las Vegas had never seen a trial that attracted this much attention. Major television networks set up cameras outside from early morning, with reporters, bloggers, and fans jostling for spots. While the media circus outside was full of dramatic confrontations, inside the courtroom, the tension was palpable in every gaze. Rick Harrison, once confident on TV, now sat silently behind the defendant's table, his face expressionless like stone, but his eyes no longer sparkled like they used to. Reputation, power, and sharpness all became meaningless as he faced the federal justice system, where there was no room for compromise or performance. The trial lasted 6 weeks, with dozens of witnesses and hundreds of documents presented, along with an unrelenting stream of incriminating evidence. Prosecutor Carla Mendez, known for her sharp prosecutorial style, didn't start with antiques or television. She looked directly at the jury and said, "This is not a case about a pawn shop. This is the case of a man who turned culture into a commodity, who sold out the past for personal gain, and he is sitting right there." The prosecutor methodically presented undeniable evidence. Emails between Rick and international partners discussing faking documents and erasing the history of items, money transfers to banks in Cyprus, and unreported transactions worth millions of dollars. One of the most shocking pieces of evidence was a recording of Rick instructing staff to remove the item from the system. The customer doesn't want to be traced. Next was a financial statement showing that over $17 million had passed through undeclared accounts over the course of a decade. Witnesses, including former shop employees, conservation experts, international appraisers, and a representative from UNESCO, took the stand one by one. They not only described illegal activities, but also condemned the cultural impact, from the abuse of religious texts to national treasures falling into private hands. A historian spoke up saying, "Rick Harrison didn't just steal items, he stole the heritage of entire nations." On the defense side, led by Matthew Crane, a familiar name in trials involving famous artists, they tried to turn the tide by personalizing the case. Rick is not a perfect man. He is a businessman, and he has sometimes made mistakes trusting people who were not trustworthy. Crane emphasized Rick's significant contributions to the community, a clean criminal record, and that, if mistakes were made, they were not intentional crimes. But in the face of overwhelming evidence, this defense felt like a small wave against a powerful storm. The climax of the trial came when Gary Wexler, the first whistleblower, took the witness stand. Unflinching and unavoidably honest, he recounted the entire process from when he first became suspicious, to his investigation, and eventually contacting the FBI. He detailed how Rick organized transactions, pressured staff to not ask, not record, and the pervasive silence and fear within the shop. When asked why he betrayed his former boss, Gary responded, "Because I used to trust him, but I couldn't stand by and watch the truth be twisted just to protect a brand." The prosecutor's indictment, delivered by Mendez, was sharp and clear. Rick Harrison used his fame to cover up his illegal activities. He trafficked in stolen artifacts, laundered money, evaded taxes, and distorted history. And today, we make it clear, fame does not exempt anyone from justice. After 5 days of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. He was guilty of all charges: smuggling antiques, tax evasion, money laundering, financial fraud, and deceiving the public. On the day of sentencing, Rick appeared in a light gray suit, his face drawn and gaunt. When the judge handed down the life sentence without the possibility of parole, citing a systematic, deliberate pattern of conduct that caused irreversible damage to the cultural heritage of humanity, Rick showed no reaction. However, just a few minutes later, he collapsed, clutching his chest, his eyes empty. Medical staff rushed in, but it was already too late. Rick Harrison, the man who once put a price on everything, had now been priced by the law itself, and there was no more room for negotiation. While the financial evidence and internal testimony were enough to convict Rick Harrison, the darkest part of the case, the one that prompted federal investigators and international organizations to get involved, was Rick's involvement in global antique smuggling networks. In the underground world of art, history is not just a cultural symbol. It's a multi-million-dollar commodity that criminal gangs hunt, fight over, and use to launder money and trade power. Following the raid, the FBI quickly identified a series of partners Rick had worked with, names encrypted in emails: Mr. X, the Professor, Lux Buyer, Yasser Art Group. When cross-referenced with international databases, these figures were no longer a mystery. Mr. X was the operator of a shell company in Nicosia, the capital of Cyprus, who had been under surveillance by Interpol since 2012 due to involvement in over 30 cases of trafficking artifacts from the Middle East. The Professor, whose real name was Rami Khalid, had been a professor of archaeology in Beirut but was dismissed after being suspected of smuggling, later becoming a middleman who handled goods from conflict zones like Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon. Rick wasn't just a client. He was the connector. With his reputation and legal system on the outside, he helped these invisible items pass through the front door. Some of the transactions were recorded in emails: ancient Egyptian statues, a Torah scroll stolen from the Warsaw Museum, 17th century oil paintings that went missing in the Balkan Wars. One message extracted by the FBI from an encrypted app even read, "The Vatican item will go through Vegas, marked DHL furniture." Italian police later confirmed that the item in question was a 15th century crucifix stolen during a church renovation in Florence. The way this network operates is not something new, but what made Rick a key figure was his ability to disguise the transactions as part of the legitimate activities of the television show. At least 7 stolen antiques had briefly appeared on Pawn Stars with the label "replica copy" before quickly disappearing from public view. These items were then sold to international collectors through companies owned by Rick. Bank account details and customs records showed that the goods were sent under the names of companies such as Furniture Restoration, Museum Props, or Historical Replicas, seemingly harmless names, but in reality, they were a cover for illegal transportation activities. Rick had also invested in real estate in Istanbul, Athens, and Sofia, cities known to be transit points for smuggling networks. In an apartment in Turkey, searched under an international warrant from Europol, police found a 16th century map, which was confirmed to have once belonged to the National Library of Austria. Fingerprints and DNA collected from a coffee sample at the scene matched Rick's biometric records. This further reinforced the argument that he was not just a victim, as his defense lawyer had claimed. He was the mastermind, the one who built the bridge between the legitimate market and the underground world. Rick's ability to manipulate public opinion was also remarkable. He used his fame to create an almost impenetrable shield. In an email sent to the Professor, Rick wrote, "No one dares to check me. They just want a signature and a selfie." And indeed, with millions of fans and a clean media image, he manipulated the antique market for nearly a decade without raising suspicion. It wasn't until the underground network in Europe was dismantled and the connections gradually pointed to Las Vegas that the reality TV kingpin was finally brought to light. Set the collapse of a legend. If the trial marked the legal collapse, the consequences for the Harrison family were an emotional and legacy breakdown. In the past, the world admired the image of three generations: Rick, his father, the old man, and his son, Corey, all working together to run the shop, build the brand, and create one of the most successful television shows in history. However, behind the cheerful scenes and friendly jokes lay a series of conflicts, hurts, and irreparable relationships. After his grandfather's death in 2018, Corey began to feel that Rick was becoming increasingly cold, controlling, and secretive. Despite being both a son and a colleague, Corey was excluded from important meetings and not allowed to be privy to information about major deals. In an interview after the case was exposed, Corey candidly said, "I love my father, but if he really did what people are saying, I can't even understand who I've been working with all these years." The will of Richard the Old Man Harrison, when made public, shocked everyone. He excluded one of his three children from the inheritance without naming anyone but implying that it wasn't Rick or Corey. This sparked a wave of controversy within the family and the media. One of Rick's stepchildren testified in court that he had been pressured to sign documents related to the company without knowing the details. Rick's ex-wife, Corey's mother, also sent a letter to the court, describing him as a calculating genius who lost his humanity, implying that fame had corrupted him. What made the trial even more painful was Corey's statement. Dressed in a dark suit, his voice trembling, he said, "I grew up with a father I deeply respected, learning from him how to work, how to live. But then I discovered he destroyed everything: trust, the family name, our shop, and I refused to inherit any part of that toxic legacy." The courtroom fell silent as Rick, for the first time, turned to face his son, his eyes quiet but showing no remorse. Rick's downfall, just minutes after the verdict was delivered, left the family in emptiness. Corey left the courtroom without saying another word. The other family members withdrew into seclusion, avoiding the media. Gold and silver pawn shop closed indefinitely. The words, "We love you," and "Why?" repeatedly appeared on the shop's gate. A handwritten note was posted on the wall. "Rick, you taught us the value of history, but you destroyed your own." Thank you for staying with us until the end of this video. If this story gave you something to think about, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss our upcoming in-depth analyses. And what do you think? Is Rick Harrison a victim or the author of his own tragedy? Leave your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your perspective.